Thanks for joining me for this afternoon session. Let me make sure. Nice. We'll start there. A couple of caveats before I start. Because this is intended as an introduction to data storytelling, it'll be pretty high level. So what I'm hoping is that if we go through some of the framework I'm going to be presenting, that at the end we'll be able to convert it into a bit more interactive conversation about your own experiences in being able to leverage communication touch points across crafts for your organizations. And I will say, so let me get back in here. This is a really bad allergy season for me, so I'm also heavily medicated. If I go onto a tangent, start talking about my dream vacation to Iceland, I'm fully requiring someone from the audience, I'm looking at you, so I'm gonna ask you to do it, just scream out, off topic, and I'll get back. So, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna begin. I really think the concept of how we tell the stories of our value as data practitioners back to our organizations is one of the most critical things we can become excellent at. It's also one of the most difficult challenges, at least in my career, that I've experienced across companies. So I'm gonna bring us back a little bit to kind of the beginning days of data science and talk a little bit about the creative component of our practice that in its origin story was incredibly important, and that somewhere down the line, I think we may have lost. Okay, so in 2010, I don't know if people are familiar with this Venn diagram, but Drew Conway published his now famous Venn diagram of data science. I've kind of seen this replicated in different ways over the years, but this is the original one. So that model of overlapping skill sets that he draws out here, it actually really did catalyze a very new way of thinking about the job of the traditional statistician as the emerging discipline of data science was shifting the foundations of that enterprise. So what was unique about Conway's diagram is that he talked a lot about emphasizing the critical component of creativity. I think we most commonly generalize this to communication, but creativity to him as well, in addition to communication, was also that hacker mindset. So that was and remains, I think, essential to successful data science work today. So for Conway, it was important to capture what he called the inherent interdisciplinary nature of this new discipline. So this meant that discipline placing new emphasis on creative discovery and knowledge building. And this was a bit different from how traditional statisticians used to approach their field. So for the data scientist in this new field, the ability to ask the right questions about the world, test those assumptions, yes, using statistical methods, but now it also included the requirement to creatively and compellingly express those ideas and results back to people outside of their field. So this is where we see the interlock between creative and scientific dimensions really becoming the field of play of the data scientist. So this is just a little bit of an abstraction that helps us see where we kind of may sit with the field of data science today. So when I think about data science, I think one of our biggest challenges, especially in applied contexts and in industry, is how to communicate insights in actionable ways back to our organization. So again, this is speaking from my experience, so I'm really interested to hear a Q&A about your own. But for applied data science in the organizations I've worked at, I found it actually challenged in a couple of different respects. So if I distill it down to two big things to me, data science has been challenged by organizational design and expectations. So what I mean by that is, where in the organization does data science report into? Depending on those reporting lines, how data science interacts and provides value, how they communicate that value can look super different. So data science reporting into itself, into engineering, into finance, into product, all changes the shape of the nature of your communication. And it also changes how they interact with business and product teams, depending on how data science is located in your organization. So is it a center of excellence? How does that inform your communication strategies? Is it embedded? That changes. Is it a service line? That absolutely changes how you communicate back to your organization. And is it a product line? So these all inform how our work is like derived, prioritized, and disseminated back to partners and stakeholders. And I also think one thing that's like changed over like at least like the past 5 years too, I've actually seen like this shift most acutely is like the nature and the shape of the data science role at organizations. It has diversified, but in some ways it's also become like more centered around the product analytics role and responsibility, while research-oriented like data science, which used to sit in some organizations as a bit of a silo, has either disappeared or moved to organizations where foundational research is explicitly a part of its mandate. So data science at most organizations I've been at is like actually translated into like product analytics with like an experimental component. That's super important because how you communicate as a product analytics data scientist is crucial. And I'll say, like, this is much more recently. Some of the accelerated implementations of generative AI products, I think, has also made the requirement of the time to value for insight generation just more critical than ever. We need to understand how to extract value from these new applications, benchmark them, evaluate them, and present back to stakeholders, potentially new use cases. Put a kind of asterisk there because like I don't know how we're going to think about this in its intersection with traditional data science yet, but I think it's like part of this broader story. So given these challenges, industry-based data scientists can often struggle to frame and communicate insights back to their organizational partners in accessible and actionable terms. And two, I think create impact for their work in an environment where the speed of decision making can often seem at odds with just like actually how data science works. And when I think about this, sometimes I'm like, there feels like the impedance mismatch between data science work and the organizations and products their work is intended to support. So when the output of data science work is not speaking the language of the business, and the work itself is not proximate to the impact domains, our effort, our outcomes, and our value is sidelined, and in many cases often lost. Okay, so all of that to say, how does data storytelling help us get it to a better place, and what is it? So really at its core, data storytelling is about taking, I'm gonna say like the next step, but it's actually a pretty monumental step away from this like relaying of a data point back to a stakeholder and actually like making intentional and effortful sense of the world. By that I mean kind of like the business context we're working in, and leveraging some of the foundations of storytelling to be able to present insights to stakeholders in a way they can understand, reflect on, reference, and put into action. So it's kind of like a new way of working. Data scientists can inform and influence through data storytelling by creating, this is something I talk a lot about with my teams, it's like create that personal touch point between your audience and your analysis. And from the data storytelling framework I'm going to walk you through right now, it is about really identifying the right size artifact, and this is a novel communication modality, so getting comfortable with that. So at Shopify, we have a wide range of insight presentation formats. Two that I have found most valuable for teams are automated pulses. So these are short, automated, contextually embedded insights that we deliver back to domain-specific audiences. So we typically automate these into Slack channels. They're not super deep. They tend to just be that data point relay, but it's like a quick like overview of like your KPIs. It's fully automated, so those tend to be really effective. And the other actually really compelling practice we adopted a couple of years ago is a data storytelling format that takes advantage of slide docs. So Slide Docs is adapted from a design studio called Duarte's Principle for Document Design. So Duarte's Slide Docs framework is a way of using presentation software, like most normally it'd be like PowerPoint, to create visual reports that are meant to be read versus presented. So unlike a chart or a visualization or a dashboard, the slide doc actually requires you to give a well-framed narrative to accompany your representation. It's actually pretty similar to a policy brief if anyone's had to write those before. And its whole motivation is around densely packed information. As well as visuals, and it's kept in a format that's intended to be digestible for your stakeholders. And again, just to underline, these are meant to be read and referred to, and they often become the archival history of discovery for individual projects, part of the documentation of the project history itself. And we have found that these support active reflection from our product partners, support more informed decision making because it offers that time to sit with the information. It is a long-lived artifact, and it builds an intentional follow-up relationship with the data scientist who owns the artifact. So you can see on here, I don't know if it's super clear, but the storytelling points that are baked into these slide docs are the data question you're trying to answer, the description of the finding, the graph or the visualization of the data, and I think this is the most important part, recommendations based on findings. And then there's typically links to the individual context components of the deep dive, as well as an invitation to connect back to the data storyteller. And often in the pairing around these documentations is where a lot of the magic happens. So this is a very creative exercise, and I think something we might want to talk about later too. It is a time investment. Right, so there's little pieces of this you can make easier through some automations, but it is something we invest in, has prepared dividends, but a lot of it is manual. So that's just the caveat. And again, a story, we think about the slide doc as having a story framework, so it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what we really want them to do is support guided exploration through the problem space and some of the answers the data scientist has been able to generate. So I'll try and give you more concretely. Well, if I take these principles and I map them back to a narrative framework more explicitly to make them more concrete, we can think of it broken down according to the critical elements of the story. So this is super reductive, right? But it's I encourage people to take it as this skeleton starting point and build complexity off of it. So there's things about a good story you just have to have. And that's where we do our initial mapping. And these are very common sense, but I've always continued to be surprised that some of these aspects are routinely missed. So I think good for us to go back to. So the main character. The central figure, a main character in any data story is the business problem. So one thing we make sure to clearly do is identify the problem, summarize what you explored when you considered the problem. Again, not just on the technical side. Sorry, I'll go back. Not just on the technical side, but on the domain side as well. So providing any reframing of the problem necessary to get both deeper insight as well as to connect the problem to your audience. Thanks for fixing that. And then we have the setting. So this is the problem space context, mostly around the kind of domain that the problem is looking to provide some solutions for. So we want to provide background information that may be key to understanding the problem, because I think what's important about these kinds of approaches as well is that you're not just presenting information, you're actually framing it in a way the narrative is supposed to guide the next action, right? So when you look at some of the best aspects of storytelling, all the information you're providing here should be leading to a logical conclusion for your reader, and that is the recommended actions that the data scientist should own. So I continuously re-emphasize that because there's two pieces that I've seen data science struggle with. One is feeling confident about presenting recommendations back to their product-like partners. And the other is the compulsion they often feel to have the conclusions fit a preset narrative. So by owning the entirety of the story, they actually get a little bit more leverage to tell the story of the data versus feel like my product partner wants to hear that this experiment was a success because it fits the business narrative, versus like owning the shape of the narrative and providing a different perspective back to the business partner to make some better decisions there. And I'm sure everyone can like relate to that. And then the third part is like the narrative. So to guide our audience effectively, we need to speak to them in a way that they understand and resonate with them. And I can't underline this enough. This is about using the language of your receiver. So if you're communicating with a non-technical audience, we try to avoid using jargon they won't be familiar with. And if you have to use technical terms and acronyms, defining them in advance can get you quite far. Like really, as in any story, the language of the presentation is critical. It's the primary component of how you engage your audience. It will make your influence and your suggestions for driving actions that translate back into value for the business that much more powerful. Because then we end with the plot, where I say the plot of the story is your recommendations back to your stakeholder. I think like analysis is so anemic without those recommendations, and like I think it builds like the required relationship between the writer and the reader. If we think about traditional narrative structures, that's required for sound business decision making to happen. Okay, so I'll go back. Sorry. This is just a little bit of an example. I know, like, I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but like, one of the pieces of success we've had with Shopify internally around data storytelling, we actually converted into a product. So my team's built a product called Shopify QL Notebooks, and we released it to our plus set of merchants last year. So this is an interactive experience that allows merchants to build their own data stories to share back with their commercial like areas, and in some cases with their own customer base. So again, this is being able to build your data storytelling experience from the ground up. And we actually did this as a test first with Black Friday, Cyber Monday period for our merchants last year. So this is like it's a huge like peak selling period for e-commerce like generally, for our merchants like in particular. And they've always been asking for ways to like share back like their performance in a compelling and exciting way, back on socials, as I said, back to like their own like commerce like environment, as well as to like their customers. And we wanted to provide more storytelling like features for our merchants in our analytics products like generally. So this was like a big experiment for us. And incredibly successful from an engagement like perspective. So we do like scaffold this experience by providing templates, so merchants don't have to know how to write SQL queries as an example. We kind of bootstrap through them. But what they get like out of selecting a template to begin working for is, again, is that guided experience for creating and being able to tell and share out their own story of their business, I think, in a beautiful way. So they can use pre-existing queries. They can make simple adaptations to them, and what they'll get for free from that is a beautiful visualization and some narrative components that, again, are like easily to share, but I think also just for like the merchants, incredibly exciting to them, because then they become the author of their own story. So we've seen like the ability, what works for us internally, also being able to translate into merchant-facing products, which is always pretty exciting. So this is something I added actually like pretty late, I think like a couple of days before I had to actually like hand the slides in. And I thought that this would be actually like a good place maybe to like stimulate some discussion from like the audience. So if I think about everything like I've shared with you, and as I said, like the manual like effort and in just real investment of like data science, like time and brain space in the insight generation and communication process, what benefits do we think we can get from new advances in generative AI to be able to reduce toil around some of those workflow places, but also just to help support, I think, like the generation of insights more generally. As I said, I feel like this is like the most valuable part of our work. And for lots of data scientists, it's also the hardest. So where do we have opportunities here? And where do we still have remaining challenges? So I kind of like leave that to you to get some feedback there. And I thank you for like for listening to this kind of like introduction of a framework. And I hope that you're able to take some pieces of it back and incorporate in your own practices.
Way to go, Wendy.
Thanks.
Wendy, thank you so very much. We're going to open the mics for questions. If anyone has a question, we can bring a mic to you. We have one question over here. Yeah, mic's on its way.
I had a question about when you were comparing it to the plot and the business as the main character in the business problem. So let's say you have a well-defined business problem that's not changing, but oftentimes in a business there's a case where you have to pivot, make one or many pivots, and that changes the story that you tell. So my question is, how do you deal with the frustration of whether it's a business partner or other teams that you're communicating and trying to communicate the story, and they sense that due to those business pivots, whatever the case may be, that the story keeps changing. So how do you deal with that frustration, and maybe what do you change in the storytelling of that?
Yeah, well, that's such a good question. I like how you frame that too. I would say that like the hallmark of any good story is probably like the change in action that creates surprises for us. So from a baseline storytelling like perspective, the shifts in intention and focus should be part of the story. And I think there's actually something really important to be learned as you map those out. I think it should be included. And I'll also say at Shopify, one of our values is thrive on change. So I was kind of laughing in my head when you're saying like, oh, like just things changing like very suddenly. I'm like, yes, that like is at Shopify, it's probably every day because we're so attuned to the different things our merchants like need sometimes in like incredibly fast emergent like ways that do need to change like how we're thinking about a problem, or a problem gets unpacked in a completely different way. So like I would encourage that to be actual part of the story. Is definitely value in seeing where you started with a solution and where you ended up as you received new information through the process, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Gen AI?
I actually have a question for you. So my journey started with data analytics way back in 2015. What are some of the challenges you find in creating a data-driven culture and being able to describe what the data means to people who may not be data literate?
Yeah, I hope I'm not saying anything like particularly controversial when I say data-driven environments are super dangerous, and like I tend to think about it in terms of like data-informed, right? And I say this because I've worked with data-driven product partners before. This is more like back in my startup days where they were so afraid of making a decision on their own that they let the data make the decision for them. And anyone who's done experimentation knows that sometimes there's business contexts that need to make a decision that is counter, let's say, to the results of an experiment. And like, there's very good reasons why you do that. So when I say it's like dangerous to be data driven, I'll say like it's because we often can make bad business decisions only relying on the data and not building like the full context about the problem we're trying to solve ahead of that. So
do you spend some of your time then trying to find a balance between educating people about we can't rely solely on the data, and then we need to use some human cognition in the mix somewhere?
Yeah.
Like, do you have to intentionally, deliberately do that?
Yeah. I think because I think really like I went on a tangent. Sorry. Like really, your question is around how do you create culture that supports like data, like being a first-class citizen.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard. Like when I moved on to the team that I'm on currently, this is I'm telling you this part of the story because like it actually is what made it easier. When I first moved onto the group of teams I'm responsible for now, I owned software engineering, data engineering, and data science. So the first thing I kind of did was like merge the work streams because they were very siloed. Like data science was operating more as a service arm than a partner, and we're building data products. So I needed them to be delivering with my engineers at the same time. So like that was probably an 8-month process while we figured out how to get like the two disciplines working together in an effective way. And not because they didn't like each other, but it was because their ways of working were so incredibly different. But like we needed them developing on the same like cadence as the engineers because they were actually building our products. So from a cultural perspective, it's all the things you do to create like healthy teams, like social rituals, the work rituals, like all the crafts had to share. So there was like you make the context playing field level for everybody, and you just work really, really hard to show, especially teams that are used to working in different ways, that they can be as effective working in this new way. So for engineers, it was like knowing they had to give data science like lead time to do the model iteration before they would get implementation guidance, and the data scientists working with time boxes because we had delivery deadlines. So it's like you don't just get to like sit in this problem for like months and months. You have 2 weeks to like land on a solution. So time boxing was super important and building a culture around that. It's really hard, yeah, but absolutely worth it. I don't think there's anyone on my teams who would say that like they don't find the ways they work with each other like super rewarding. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. That's very insightful. I think we have time for 2 more questions. We have a question here. Yeah. Mic's on its way.
Hello, I really appreciated your talk. The thing that kind of resonated with me the most is the part where you're like, the importance of giving that recommendation at the end as part of the resolving the story. Otherwise, it's just a story without an ending or something like that. Yeah. In my experience, obvious, easy recommendations aren't something you come by very easily. Like, I did all this analysis and I'd be often very paralyzed to give any recommendation. So is that just a non-starter at this point? Or is the answer like, yeah, we don't know, sorry?
Like
would it be a failure of data science to come up with anything? Or it's like the uncertainty is so big. What happens when you don't have that recommendation or that answer?
I think there's I'm not saying I'm right here, but like I've always told my teams, there's always a recommendation. And I don't think that data science has to eat all of the risk, right? Because like one of the things you're also trying to build that makes the data storytelling like approach like effective is like that pairing piece. And I like in retrospect, I probably should have pulled that out in my conversation like points more, but it's like you're sitting with like you're sitting in a pairing session with like, let's say it's your product partner, but could be like your business partner, and you're walking through the implications like together. Ultimately, the data scientist isn't like the decision maker often, right? You're giving recommendations back to the decision maker, and you're ensuring that they understand the risk. And sometimes also like your problem space is so ambiguous, you haven't had time to make it like incredibly like clear. And so that's the underlying assumption, is that you've asked me to go really quickly and just sketch out a solution space. So the risk is going to be higher. And like, let's say the product manager ends up like owning and agreeing to the risk, but it is make it a little more level, because like, I don't think it's like the data scientist's responsibility to, as I said, like eat the risk that ultimately is a business decision. But like big part of storytelling is relationship building. So I hope it plays.